Today I'm talking to Mehdi Hasan, who's the senior political editor for the New Statesman magazine. We're going to be talking about the violence that's going on in Syria at the moment and also the developing situation in Iran. Mehdi Hasan, thank you very much for talking to me today. Now, we've seen observers being sent into Syria who seem to have done nothing to stop the violence. In fact, the death toll has risen from 20 to 30 people a day. How good do you think the observers are at implementing their mandate?
I do think they're very good, given how one of the leaders of the mission when it originally went in was a Sudanese general who's been accused of carrying out war crimes and ethnic cleansing in Darfur, which slightly hobbled both the legitimacy of the mission and the trust that a lot of Syrian opposition groups had in the Arab League mission. Since then, the Saudi Arabians have complained about the mission. They've pulled out their observers, they're pulling out their ambassador. I mean, the Arab League has really been all over the place on Syria. On the one hand, it's condemned Syria. It was praised for the first time condemning a fellow Arab nation and putting a resolution in a few months ago. Since then, its own mission has been criticised for, among other things, the personnel it's deployed and its inability to stop the violence. I think the real issue is that the Syrians need to allow in a much more neutral, a much more wide-ranging, a much more forceful international observer mission if they've got nothing to hide. If they're genuinely not killing innocent people, then what have they got to hide?
And what about sanctions? The UK recently proposed tougher sanctions on Syria, things like travel bans, asset freezes. What effect, if any, do you think they'll have?
It depends how targeted the sanctions are. I'm always on the fence over sanctions, given the experience we had with Iraq for over a decade of sanctions, which caused more suffering to the people than to the Saddam regime. I support sanctions if they're targeted against regime members, if they're targeted against people who are indicted for human rights violations or war crimes, fine. If they squeeze the country itself and the people who've done nothing wrong, then I think that's a mistake. I think we have to think much more creatively about Syria. I'm not one of those who supports military action. Syria isn't Libya. It won't be easy. It won't be legitimate without a UN resolution. And more innocent people will die than have already died. But that doesn't mean you just turn a blind eye to the violence that's going on. More than 5,000 people have died according to the UN's own figures, and Assad is a man who clearly is not backing down. You look at some of his interviews, he's not as bonkers as Colonel Gaddafi, but he says some pretty crazy things about how it's nothing to do with me, not my orders, these are all armed rebels, everyone who's dying.
And let's talk about the opposition for a little bit. There appear to be three sort of distinct blocks. There's the Free Syrian Army, there's a kind of external opposition, there's people in the street. Do you think they'll be able to form any kind of cohesive group? Well,
that's one of the objections that a lot of people are having against any kind of external military action, which is where is the legitimacy? In Libya, you had a opposition movement which, despite being consisting of different groups, secular, religious, etc., indigenous, and those outside the country, they did form a united opposition for the purposes of getting rid of Gaddafi, and they controlled territory. Benghazi, it's what prompted the intervention to begin with. In Syria, they don't control any territory, they don't control any cities or towns, and there is this division between the external opposition figures like the leader of the Syrian National Council, who's based in Paris, and those who are on the streets, who have said again and again to Western reporters, to human rights groups, that we don't want military intervention. We're opposed to both the Syrian president, we're opposed to the Assad regime, and we're opposed to Western intervention. We saw what happened in Iraq. I mean, the Syrians, what's interesting about the Syrians is that they saw up close and personal the effects of Western intervention in Iraq, because hundreds of thousands of Iraqi refugees fled into Syria. They know the consequences of a kind of ill-timed, ill-thought-out, heavy-handed Western intervention, which just exacerbates the violence.
And the Free Syrian Army, as far as you can see, what are they fighting for? Does it look like genuine democracy?
There's a huge debate about the FSA and how much, first of all, how many defections that are going on, because they claim to be getting dozens and dozens of defectors every day, every week, from Assad's Syrian armed forces, and yet others, independent observers, not just the Assad regime and its apologists, are saying, well, actually, it's a trickle, and they're exaggerating their own strength in order to, again, justify Western intervention. If you look at the history of Western interventions, so-called humanitarian interventions, you always see there's an equivalent of the FSA on the ground, whether in Libya, or if you go back to Kosovo and the KLA, which also said, give us the guns, give us the air support, and we'll do the fighting. And in Afghanistan, you had the Northern Alliance. And actually, it turns out that these groups tend, A, not to have as much legitimacy as they claim, and B, not to have as much military strength as they claim.
And the Free Syrian Army is accused of killing people itself, isn't it? Do we have any idea of sort of the number of those casualties?
Well, again, without wanting to overdo the comparison between Libya and Syria, one of the things you see is when you do support rebel groups, sometimes unsavory groups, my enemy's enemy is my friend, you support people who are perhaps not the greatest defenders or advocates of human rights themselves. In Afghanistan, we supported all sorts of unsavory warlords and still do. In Libya, the opposition groups, the National Transition Council there in Libya was accused by Human Rights Watch during the conflict of carrying out all sorts of killings and abuses of prisoners, which still still haven't been resolved or properly accounted for. Do we then want to lurch into a Syrian conflict where, again, we are ignorant of what's going on the ground? We're not experts on who these people are, what these groups stand for. And the FSA, of course, if you consist of defecting soldiers from an army that's carried out human rights abuses, then a lot of those defectors will have been part of those human rights abuses. That's just the horrible reality of the world we live in.
And in terms of the actual people, do you see a link between the Libyan Islamists and those on the ground in Syria?
Well, there've been reports, and as with all these conflicts, they're grey and they're murky, that Libyan Islamist groups fighting in Libya, finished fighting in Libya, have transferred over to help some of the Syrian opposition groups.
And do you see an inexorable move towards intervention?
Since the new year, my position is changing, and I can imagine a scenario where we are, where NATO is asked, or the British government or the American government is asked to enforce a no-fly zone, to enforce some kind of safety corridor. Look, which would be with the ostensible aim of protecting human rights, all well and good, but would push us into all sorts of areas of the Middle East we don't want to be involved in, because Syria, for example, is a much bigger player in the Israel-Arab conflict. It's a much bigger country and tougher to overcome and beat militarily. If it took us that long to beat Libya, how long do you think it would take us to beat Syria?
How far do you think Syria is already essentially a battlefield between Iran and the West?
The Israelis have been clear for many years that if you can pull Syria out of Iran's orbit, you will weaken Iran, which they consider to be the number one enemy, the number one menace in the neighbourhood, the number one threat to Israel's strategic interests. So if you can get Syria away from Iran, either through a diplomatic deal, which they've tried for many years, or through regime change, which seems to be the direction of travel now, then it will definitely weaken Iran. And all roads in the Middle East right now do seem to lead back to Tehran.
And Saudi Arabia's relationship with Iran is increasingly hostile. It accuses Iran of supporting this protesting Shiite minority. How do you think that could play out?
Saudi Arabia's own position is brazenly one-sided, brazenly self-serving and hypocritical. Here you have Saudi Arabia having pulled its ambassador out of Damascus, having complained about the Arab League on the ground and its human rights observations. Well, first of all, the Saudi Arabians have their own human rights abuses to deal with at home, their own oppressive regime. But even if you take the Arab Spring, the Saudis have thrown their weight behind the Syrian opposition to Assad, and yet have done their utmost best to stop the Arab Spring, to stop the revolts in all of the other countries. In Egypt, in Bahrain, where Saudi troops went into Bahrain, are still in Bahrain, suppressing protests in Bahrain, and yet in Syria, they're supporting the opposition. If that's not one-sidedness, I don't know what is, and that shows you that Saudi Arabia's own interests have nothing to do with human rights or democracy. Of course not. How could Saudi Arabia be interested in such issues? It's about trying to deal with Iran, and we know from WikiLeaks that the Saudi king told the American government, cut the head off the snake, i.e. deal with the snake that is Iran, in his view.
And Iran has been threatening recently to block the Strait of Hormuz, which of course we know is the main export route for Gulf oil. What do you think the political consequences of that could be?
I'm deeply and genuinely worried about what will happen if the Iranians shut the Strait of Hormuz as they promised. I think you'll have a situation where we start sleepwalking into war on both sides, where there are extremists on both sides who want a conflict, who would love a conflict because it would serve their purposes in the West. There are people who want to take out Iran, both for America's national interests, so-called, and of course for the Israelis. And in Iran, there are hardliners who see that the Islamic Revolution is failing, who are seeing the Green Movement popular, who are seeing lots of people protesting against the regime, and see a foreign war, who see the idea of being under attack as a way of uniting the country. So there are hardliners on both sides, and I think the people in the middle have to be careful that we don't allow the hardliners to kind of allow us to sleepwalk into war, where they shut the Straits of Hormuz, and the Americans, who I suspect don't want to go to war, not in an election year, are forced to come in order to secure the oil and to protect the Israelis if Israel were to attack Iran as well, which is a $64,000 question.
You've mentioned that this year is of course an election year in the US. Do you think that the US is likely to wait until that election is over, when in doing so it could anger Israel by not acting sooner?
Well, that's the interesting question. I think of their own free will, I don't think they do want to go to war. I think Obama is running on a campaign of trying to energize his base, saying, we're the guys who ended Iraq, we're the guys who are going to bring troops home from Afghanistan, we're the guys who took a back seat in Libya and didn't put boots on the ground. The idea that you would then kick off a conflict with Iran, and as one American general put it, if you liked Iraq and Afghanistan, you'll love Iran. I mean, it would be a major conflict. And I think if you listen to, for example, Defense Secretary Panetta saying recently that actually an attack on Iran would have unintended consequences, would be a backlash against American troops in the region. Clearly he's not keen on it. And yet, if the Israelis were to strike Iran and Iran were to strike back, then the Americans will be drawn in whether they like it or not, because they can't abandon Israel. They can't abandon Israel for strategic purposes. They certainly can't abandon Israel in an election year.
We're in very shaky economic times globally at the moment, but what no one seems to be talking about is what the economic consequences of a war with Iran would be.
In an age where we are facing a double-dip recession, possibly another Great Depression, where oil prices are already so high, we could see an attack on Iran pushing oil prices above $150 a barrel. Some analysts say even a record high of above $200 a barrel, which really would tip the entire world economy, not just us, but the Asians, the Chinese, back into a major, major recession, major downturn. And I think people have kind of turned a blind eye to this. And only recently, with the Iranians threatening to block the Strait of Hormuz, where I think a third of the world's seaborne oil passes through, have people started to go, well, wait a minute, what the hell is going to happen to oil prices? And I think that's a factor in the American government's reasoning as well, perhaps less so in the Israeli government's reasoning.
Mehdi Hasan, thank you very much.
Thank you.